What's going on, people? Welcome to United View and welcome back to the Tactical View. On today's show, we'll be taking a look back at Manchester United versus Bournemouth, a nice 1-0 win away from home and another clean sheet for Manchester United's defence. And we'll be having a little look at some of the features of our game plan of late, which will apply to things we're looking to do against Manchester City. So, whilst on paper, a game against Bournemouth away from home towards the end of the season when their Premier League status is already secure isn't the most interesting, there's a lot of things that we're doing already that we're putting in place in preparation for the FA Cup final against Manchester City. So, should be a good show. Let's get into it. Now, first of all, we'll have a little look at the Bournemouth team and in terms of how they set up. It was a 4-2-3-1 on paper. In terms of the quality that they've got in their team, I think obviously they've got a lot of legs in midfield through Jefferson Lerma. Lewis Cook's decent on the ball, no real outstanding quality. What was interesting tactically though from the way they set up was the difference in the wingers, the sort of dynamics of the two wingers. So you've got Jayden Anthony on one side and you've got David Brooks on the other side. And what we typically saw when Bournemouth had the ball was Jayden Anthony would stay fairly wide, try and sort of get around the outside a little bit more, whereas David Brooks would look to pop up inside in these midfield positions, and that gave United a few problems with some of the ways that we tried to play. In terms of how Bournemouth set up out of possession and what they did when United had the ball, it was more of a 4-4-2 in the press, so Ryan Christie would join Dominic Solanke here, and they tried to stay fairly compact in that 4-4-2 shape. So there's not too much complexity there, but it did give United a few little challenges to deal with, so we'll show how that matched up again now. And the main thing is something that we've seen pretty much throughout the season in the way United set up defensively. And that is because United tend to set up with a man-for-man approach in midfield. When teams do things like pushing a winger a little bit infield, that gives our fullbacks a decision to make as to whether they go and join and sort of lock themselves into a 1v1 battle in the central areas to help out Casemiro, help out Eriksen, help out Bruno Fernandes, or whether they stay wide and hold their position, sort of banking on the fact that the opposition fullback will overlap if the winger's tucked in. So what I mean by that is what we typically saw from United when Bournemouth had the ball is if we were going to press, you'd have Martial sort of leading it, you'd have Bruno on top of Jefferson Lerma, Eriksen goes up onto Lewis Cook or sometimes the other way around, and then what you'd see from the wingers is they'd stay in sort of a 4-1-4-1 shape, so they're, as part of that four there, stay connected, and what that means is that space there for Casemiro is quite large. So obviously, as we said, with Jayden Anthony staying fairly wide, he's sort of locked in a 1v1 with Wan-Bissaka. Nothing really to worry about there. And obviously, Casemiro here as the defensive midfielder is mainly worried about the number 10. So what was happening then was when David Brooks was tucking into these areas here, it was giving Luke Shaw a decision to make, whether he stays in his position here on the left of defence, or whether he tucks in and follows David Brooks. And I think earlier in the season, that's an area where United sometimes struggled, and an area where, indeed, I think Luke Shaw on a personal level in recent times has struggled a little bit because he was never, at least until this season, I don't think he was necessarily the most confident at knowing when to go with someone and when to pass them on. And when he did pass players on, having the communication skills, the leadership to make the right decision of when to do it, and also to make sure that the player he's he's passing him on to knows that he's there. So it's about making those decisions to make sure that if the ball's on this side, then sure, yeah, Luke Shaw can tuck in and Casemiro will deal with Christie. But if the ball's coming down this side, just Luke Shaw being aware of when he should go in there and when he shouldn't, because if Adam Smith gets down the line, there needs to be someone there to deal with that situation. Now, in terms of Manchester United's out of possession approach, we've seen this sort of situation quite a lot of times throughout the season, but where this leads on to what we might face against Manchester City is something that we can talk about in terms of there's two main lines defensively that teams are worried about. And those two lines, so people will have heard the terms mid-block, high block, low block, and you can have the same thing for press. You can press high up the pitch, you can press in your own third if you want to, or you can have a mid-press. So there's sort of three terms there. But what defines whether it's a mid-block, a low block, a high block, or a press is there's two lines that do that. Number one, the line at the top end of the pitch, the line of engagement, the line beyond which the opposition get, where you actually start in and that's your trigger to engage the press. And at the back, you've got the offside line or how deep your defence starts. And obviously, if you want to be compact, you want to make the gap between those lines as small as you possibly can. So if we say here is a line of engagement, if it will let me draw that line. So let's say, for example, that line there is the line of engagement. And this line here is where we want to hold the offside line. The smaller you can get those two lines, the closer together you can get those lines, the more compact you'll be as a team in terms of restricting the amount of space that the opposition can play through. Now, these last 2 weeks are probably the first time all season that Manchester United have had a lot of time on the training ground, and this is something that Erik ten Hag has really worked on, in terms of both making sure that the line of engagement is in the right place, so that's the line at the top end of the pitch, but also that defensive line there, that offside line, squeezing that up as high as you possibly can to limit that space in the middle, so that if Casemiro is left with this situation of maybe the opposition winger tucking in as well as the number 10, or the striker dropping in, then he's able to control, the space is as small as possible so that he's able to control it. Now, this is going to be really important against Manchester City because they've got players that are really good at operating in those pockets, the likes of Kevin De Bruyne, you've got Gundogan. If you let them roam free in those sorts of spaces, even the likes of Phil Foden from the bench, Jack Grealish cutting inside, John Stones, Rodri, they can all play in those areas if you let those areas appear. So it's really important that Manchester United have a game plan with that in mind to try and restrict that space. And what I think we've seen of late is that rather than starting our press really high, we've actually let opposition teams carry the ball a little bit higher up the pitch. And the reason behind that is that most teams now have a goalkeeper who's capable of playing out from the back and becoming that extra man. And what that means then is that if you're pressing high up the pitch, let's say you're mainly pressing in the opposition half, you've only got 10 players really, because your goalkeeper is going to be a little bit deeper, he's not really involved in the press, and you've got 11 opposition players, so you're already at a one-man disadvantage there. If you then add on top of that, most teams want to sort of keep a +1, a spare player at the back to help sweep up for long balls, you're already then, numerically, you've got 9 players that are involved in the press versus the opposition having 11 players to play out. So what you've got to do then is try to make sure that players can do 2 jobs at once. So pressing players can cover 2 players at once. So where that feeds in is, let's say if Martial's going to press here, he'll need to make sure if Senesi's got the ball, he needs to make sure that he isn't just pressing Senesi from any angle, he's blocking off one of the passing lanes into midfield, thereby doing 2 jobs at once. That's one way of doing it. But the other thing that's really important, and will be even more so against Manchester City because of how good Ederson is on the ball, and even Ortega if Pep chooses to play him in the game, is that we've got to disconnect that goalkeeper from being part of the unit. So as well as that disadvantage that you can sort of make up by having players do 2 things at once in the press, obviously that means players going half and half, and sometimes if you're playing against a really good team, they can exploit that. So what you want to do is take out a man from the opposition team by pressing a little bit deeper. So if United are able to let the opposition team come a little bit higher up the pitch instead and compress the space between those lines there, what we do, rather than being in a position here where Bournemouth can go back to the keeper and use the goalkeeper as the extra man, because we're letting them come a little bit higher up the pitch, they can't use the keeper as the extra man without sort of going back a long way and sort of killing the momentum of their own attack. So what we really scored in this game, which is surprising when you consider we're playing a team like Bournemouth who are lower down the league, you'd expect that a team like United would want to try and press them as high as possible in the final third to try and sort of force mistakes, regain the ball, turn it over. And we did that when we lost the ball. But in terms of when they had goal kicks, when they reset the picture, we let them come up the pitch to try and disconnect Neto so we couldn't get involved at all. And it was only when the ball got to about here that we then actually start pressing, actually start trying to get involved. And what that does is, obviously, because we've narrowed the gap between these 2 lines, we've made it as compact as possible, meaning that we've got the best possible chance to regain possession. I think we did a really good job of that. With Martial, you could see, rather than when the ball was up here, Martial was just going side to side, not engaging, not biting, just letting them come higher and higher up the pitch. And then when they got to about here, this sort of line, then he would bite, then we'd jump. And if a Bournemouth player dropped in, if David Brooks dropped in to receive, Luke Shaw was right on his back, really aggressive, making sure he couldn't turn. And in those situations, Luke Shaw in particular was fantastic at turning the ball over. United really compact, so there's not much space for these Bournemouth defensive players to find balls forward. And if they did, there was always a United player on their back ready to turn the ball over. And that is going to be crucial against Manchester City because it's really tough to beat them and you have to have the right defensive approach to do so. If you sit too deep, they'll eventually create something. If you go and press them too high, they've got the keeper and their technical ability, they're going to be able to work their way around you. So the way to beat that is a mid-block with these lines as close together as you possibly can to create zones of really intense pressure because you're so compact in between those lines. So that's a little look ahead to the way we're probably going to play against City, which is something I quite like from the way Erik ten Hag set up. You can see, in comparison to under Ole Gunnar Solskjaer, when oftentimes the game plan would be very varied each week. It would be sort of what happened in 3 days' time had nothing to do with what's happened before. Whereas Ten Hag, you can see when it's leading up to a big game, he's got a particular focus for that month that he's trying to build in training and getting ready for that by doing it more in games. You can see that with the defensive approach now. And I think a good example of that is here. What you can see, first of all, is that obviously with Martial's positioning here, he's not really aggressive trying to go and close down the centre-backs. He's content to just drop off. Bruno's dropping off, Eriksen's dropping off there as well. But you've got connection there, strong connection between the lines there, tiny gap between Eriksen and Antony. And again, small gap between Eriksen and Bruno Fernandes. And again, look, you've got Eriksen with Jefferson Lerma, Bruno with Lewis Cook there. And the idea is that we make it really difficult for the opposition to play through midfield, particularly through the centre of the pitch, and we're as compact as possible to try and sort of win that ball back in 50-50 situations, as we spoke about, and then you can turn that into attack quickly. Whereas earlier in the season, we had a bit of a distinction where the lines were too far apart to the point where opposition teams were able to get the ball into midfield. If they bypassed this line here of United, they had so much space. Whereas now, because the defence are that much higher, which comes from being aggressive, comes from having players that are quick. Obviously, Varane's able to cover space if he needs to. Lindelof's the same in terms of body position-wise, always on the half turn, ready to go back if he needs to. But that keeps the line higher, compresses that space so that if this line gets bypassed, Casemiro's just here, a little bit further behind, and only then a tiny gap to the defence. So it's been really good to see that defensively, and that is a massive, massive hint as to how we're going to play against Manchester City. Now, the next thing I want to talk about in today's show is, that's the defensive approach from Man United when the other team have got sustained possession. The next thing I want to talk about is what we did on a transitional basis. So this is sometimes a little bit harder to analyse in terms of the amount of variability that can come in those situations. But what we've got here is a situation where we've got Bruno Fernandes on the ball here. United are on the attack, and what you can see is you've got Luke Shaw in the box there, a great example of the fluidity that our attack have got under Erik Ten Hag in terms of getting players into the box, just players being in the right positions. It doesn't matter who's where. We saw so many times yesterday against Bournemouth. We saw Luke Shaw, we saw Wan-Bissaka popping up in the box. At times, Wan-Bissaka was the highest man up the pitch, with Martial dropping a bit deeper, other players dropping deeper. Loads of fluidity in there, but the idea is we create a front five. So you've got, I think it's Sancho out on this side here, just out of shot. You've got Luke Shaw there, you've got Martial in there, you've got, I think that's Wan-Bissaka in there, and you've got Antony just there. So you've got the front five across the pitch there. Sancho, Shaw, Martial, Wan-Bissaka and Antony. A little bit deeper than that in this situation, you've got Bruno and Eriksen. That's sort of the second line, as Erik Ten Hag would say. And deeper than that, you've got Lindelof, who's so high up the pitch. And look, this is something I wanted to highlight because the best teams in world football have been able, for a long time now, to set the conditions for when they lose the ball whilst they've still got it. And what that means is that they've got players in the right positions before they lose the ball so that you can set that counter-press. Because counter-pressing isn't just players sort of randomly chasing the ball after they've lost it. You've got to have players close together in the area where the ball's most likely to go so that you're able to react quickly. And from there, you've got to have the technique right, you've got to have the basics at every level of the game set up so that you can react as quick as you possibly can. So positioning-wise, it's really encouraging that although United have got that front five, we've also, because of this player here in the Bournemouth shirt, this guy is Dominic Solanke. That's the striker. That's Ryan Christie, the number 10. They're on the edge of their own box. So this is something that's probably a little bit unnatural or more of a recent development in football, is that centre-backs don't necessarily want to be on the halfway line all the time. You can go higher than that. If the striker and the number 10 are on the edge of their own box, get higher up the pitch so that their only outball Bournemouth is if they get the ball into Solanke now and he's able to get past Lindelof, who's literally 2 yards away from him. So all it takes is one bad touch from Solanke and United have won that ball back instantly. And even if Solanke takes a good touch, because Lindelof's so high up the pitch, in such a good position, he's able to delay the counter-attack. So if we roll this on to the next shot, what you can see is Lindelof's body position here is absolutely fantastic. So again, you can see the amount of players United have got in the box. You've got that front five again, as we spoke about. You've got Antony there, you've got Eriksen and Bruno here. Bruno's given away the ball, unfortunately, gave away quite a few times in that previous from the previous shot. And what you can see is Lindelof's body position here is fantastic. He's low, ready to react to the movements of Solanke there. He's on his toes, leaning forward, ready to go wherever Solanke takes him. And the other thing that I really like about this as well is the way he's shepherding Solanke. So with his body position, he's trying to show Solanke this side away from danger towards the outside of the pitch and away from, crucially, this support player here, Ryan Christie. And by doing that, he's able to disconnect that counter-attack and slow it down to allow the other United players to get back onside. Now, the gap between the previous image and this one is only 2 seconds. So within 2 seconds, we've gone from 5 players in the opposition box, Bruno just about to find the ball into the box, giving the ball away. And in that split second, that tiny interval of time, this action from Lindelof is vital. Having the right basics in place to do the fundamentals right to stop Solanke being able to get up the pitch and counter quickly. We then roll it on to the next frame, and because of Lindelof's body position there, because of how he was able to delay Dominic Solanke, you can look, again, this is only, I think, a second and a half further on than the previous shot, but you can see how many United players are now ball side or goal side of the ball. You've got Eriksen back goal side, you've got Bruno goal side, and this, full credit to them in terms of sprinting back, but it's Lindelof's action there has stopped Solanke being able to run 20 yards forward in that time, and has now meant that he's got Antony right on him, so he's under pressure. But you've also got Wan-Bissaka sprinting back alongside Antony. And again, that means that there's no option for Solanke out wide. So the only option Dominic Solanke has got at this moment, because of United's structure, is that ball into Ryan Christie. And what you can't see out of shot is that whilst Lindelof's really high, Varane's a little bit deeper, sweeping there. So if Solanke even slightly overhits that pass, that is going straight through to Raphael Varane. So what you've seen here from United in these shots is the structure that we've set in place to prepare for a ball loss before we've actually lost it. So on a different day, if Solanke took a heavy touch on the edge of the box, Lindelof himself can win that ball back, start another wave of attack. But even in the worst case, or that heavy touch doesn't happen and we haven't been able to counter-press and win the ball back, we're still able to delay the counter-attack and give ourselves the best possible chance of stopping any dangerous situation occurring. So I think that's really nice from United. It's a massive thumbs up to Erik ten Hag's structure and his approach, because it shows that he's not just thinking about the different phases of the game in isolation. He's aware that in football, and particularly at Premier League level, the transitions between those phases are so quick, and it's so important to have the right fundamentals in place. All it would have taken in that shot where we showed Lindelof's body position, if he was sort of maybe really tall, standing up tall, he was sort of leaning on his heels, wasn't able to react quickly. All it would take is a body feint from Solanke, he'd be out, Christie would be up the pitch, and all of a sudden Bournemouth have got Solanke and Christie running at Raphael Varane, which is a really dangerous situation. So from a coach's perspective, what Ten Hag's done really well there is made sure that the body shape of the players and their positioning is appropriate to try and stop the transition before it's even occurred. And what you can see now, again, this is just 2 seconds on from the previous shot, is by this point, Solanke's been forced to turn back, and now he's got Eriksen, you've got Antony, you've got Martial there, shutting off his options. There's only one option for him there, and because there's only one option, Bruno Fernandes has already seen that. He's anticipating, he's gesturing over there, over there, over there, and he's ready to gamble and go and close the guy down. So what you can see is how United there, through getting the different levels of the game right, getting the technical aspect right, getting the tactical aspect in terms of positioning right, and then getting the sheer work rate of these guys sprinting back goal side. You can see Wan-Bissaka again there, sprinting back as well. Varane's here, obviously he was sweeping. Lindelof's there. We've not backed off too far. Again, a nice sort of demonstration of how we're trying to keep that defensive line really high. They've not just kept backing off, they've stayed as high as they possibly can to keep it compact, and you can see how well United have defended the transition there. So that was fantastic, and it's a massive sort of good sign for Ten Hag, a massive tick in the box that yes, he can make United much better at defending transitions and hopefully keep us with a good defensive record. The final image again, you can see, as we spoke about earlier, now that the Bournemouth have gone back to their defence, they've reset the picture, and United have sort of stopped the press. Bruno's dropped back in there to deal with the Bournemouth midfielder there, and you can see that as the picture's been reset, as we spoke about, we're not looking to engage really high, we're engaging a little bit deeper to disconnect the keeper from the play, and so we mitigate that man advantage that they have through having the ball playing goalkeeper, or a keeper who's able to get involved. So that was quite nice as well. The last thing we're going to talk about today is a little bit of stuff on the way that United played in terms of when we had the ball. And what you can see is, as we mentioned at the start, Bournemouth set up when United had the ball in mainly a 4-4-2 shape. So you had Solanke and you had Christie pressing the United team. And sort of behind that, it was Lerma and Lewis Cook in midfield. You had Jadon Anthony and David Brooks there. And what you typically see in terms of the way things worked, especially when United got higher up the pitch, is firstly to play out. United used deep fullbacks again, a major theme of the stuff Erik Ten Hag does, rather than a lot of coaches using one of the defensive midfielders dropping between the centre backs to create a 3-on-2 here, then pushing the fullbacks a little bit higher. What United often do is use deep fullbacks, and that's really helpful when you've got someone with the technical ability of Luke Shaw, who was absolutely fantastic in that game on Saturday. One of Luke Shaw's best performances, I think, for a while, but that shows why Luke Shaw really is one of the few world-class players that Manchester United genuinely have. Such brilliant grasp of everything to do with the football, and defensively he was fantastic as well. And that's why Ten Hag wants to get him on the ball as much as possible, so we use the deep fullbacks to try and progress the ball up the pitch. And then, what I really liked again from United, and something that Erik Ten Hag mentioned in his quotes after the game actually, something that he talked about, was how United used runs not just from the first line, but also from the second line and even the third line at times as well. So what you see is, as we spoke about, as we saw in those pictures, Bournemouth are really, really deep defensively, and obviously defending with their back four. United aimed to create an extra man, sort of an overload, by creating a front five. So whether it was Sancho wide and somebody else underlapping, let's say at this moment it's Sancho and Antony holding the width. You've got Martial in the middle and you've got Bruno in there. And let's say Eriksen's pushed up at this moment in time. What you then see is a second line there. So that's the top line, the line of five. You then see Luke Shaw and maybe Wan-Bissaka in here. Maybe Casemiro a little bit deeper, and you've got the centre-backs there. And the centre-backs will just push as high as the Bournemouth strikers drop deep. But what was really nice to see was that when, for example, the ball was with Jadon Sancho here, you'd always have Bruno making that underlapping run. But when Sancho was in a position to cross, Alan Smith would have to back off. You'd see runs from Luke Shaw, you'd see runs from Wan-Bissaka to get themselves in the box. And that's so crucial because it gives these Bournemouth midfield players a massive challenge. Do they follow these runs? And if they do follow the runs, if they don't react quickly enough, Wan-Bissaka and Luke Shaw are travelling forwards. These guys have got to turn around and go backwards. There's a high chance that you can see a runner from deep arriving there before the Bournemouth midfield player can track them. And that's exactly how Manchester United got our first goal, with a fantastic run from deep from Casemiro in that game. Really well found from Eriksen from a ball in this sort of area, then a brilliant overhead kick from Casemiro. So it's those runs from deeper that are able to disrupt that Bournemouth defence. I think the other thing to note is the timing of those movements as well. So something that we often see as well is that when, let's say, Wan-Bissaka picks up the ball in this sort of area, again, notice that he's, in these areas, the pivot players, whether it's the fullbacks or whether it's sometimes Bruno or Eriksen, they're a little bit narrower, inverted in those areas so that, again, they're prepared for the transition before it happens. But what we see is, from this position, you've got our winger, in this case Antony, always just wider than the Bournemouth fullback. Again, the concept of minimum width from Erik Ten Hag, meaning that you don't want to be right on the touchline unless the ball's on that side. Just wider than there, just wider than the fullback is enough. That ball will be played out by Wan-Bissaka, and as soon as Antony takes that first touch, or as soon as that ball's gone out there, you see Wan-Bissaka sprinting, and sometimes it'll be the fullback that thinks, hang on, I've got a cover, I'll drop off a yard, giving Antony room to cut inside and take on his man there. But at other times in this game, it was actually the centre-backs that were having to deal with that. So it was causing a moment of indecision with Senesi here in particular, with Wan-Bissaka underlapping, where he wasn't sure, hang on, I need to really be defending, stay in my defensive line, hold the line and defend what's here, which is Christian Eriksen. But at times, because of Wan-Bissaka's movement, he took just half a step that way, which allowed that ball to be played inside or a cut back to the edge of the box. So it's those movements from the second line that are fantastic from United going forward. And that was a major factor in our attacking play. So the final thing we'll look at today is the statistics and sort of how the game panned out overall. You can see from United again, 38% possession, or 38% of the game was played in the Bournemouth third. So that's really encouraging in terms of the way that United are able to sustain our attacks, able to keep the ball high up the pitch for long periods of the game. Again, a lot of the game in the middle third, again, that's a good reflection on how hard United were to break down, because we were sort of sitting in that middle third. That was where we were trying to win the ball back. As we've said, disconnect the Bournemouth goalkeeper, keep the defensive line, the offside line, as high as possible and be compact in that middle third. And in terms of the way we played out, again, as has been a common theme through pretty much the whole season, a lot of our play comes down that left side through Luke Shaw and on Saturday through Jadon Sancho as well, who was fantastic technically, really secure, didn't really lose the ball. Yes, he's still got a little bit of a problem in terms of bottling 50-50s, which can be really frustrating, particularly on the edge of the United box. But he's getting better, and technically, he very rarely loses the ball. Defensively, he'll always sprint back to get in position, even if he doesn't necessarily put the right number of challenges in just yet, but hopefully he's working on that. So that's why United, again, another reason why United was so stable defensively. And finally, the XG timeline here. Look, this is domination. United, pretty much from the Casemiro goal 8 minutes in, always ahead, always creating more and more stuff. And by the sort of the 60th minute, 65th minute, United were well ahead on XG. And to be honest, it's another one of those games where clinical finishing has been an issue for Manchester United. And we should have scored 2 or 3 goals, let's be honest. So, fingers crossed that for the rest of the season, we've got 2 games left against Chelsea at Old Trafford on Thursday night, Fulham on Sunday. Hopefully, United can get the 1 point needed to secure Champions League football for next season. And then we've got the big one, the FA Cup final against Manchester City. In terms of tactical views content for the rest of the year, you'll be looking at another one next Monday after the Fulham game. And of course, a preview show for the massive battle against Manchester City. And of course, some of the features that we're seeing already from Erik ten Hag's team, particularly defensively, will be things that we're looking to build on, and our little sneak previews as to what may lie ahead against Manchester City and how Manchester United can beat them. Because as difficult as it is not impossible. We've just got to find the best game plan we can, hope that we execute it, and hope City miss a lot of chances. Hopefully you've enjoyed watching the show. We'll see you again very soon. Cheers for watching, and let us know what you thought in the comments down below.